Does not yet have one, it'll just help you keep up. It's also it's a teacher thing. In 1946, Winston Churchill was invited by President Harry Truman to a university in Missouri to talk about the coming threat that Americans had not yet awakened to. For years in World War II, the Soviets had been considered to be our Russian allies. And Churchill came to speak about an iron curtain that had descended across the continent of Europe, from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. And behind that iron curtain, the flickering lights of Western civilization were guttering and dying under Soviet oppression. Well, Americans listened, and we learned about the Russians, and we learned about the communists. And by God's grace, and with the help of Ronald Reagan, Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, and so many others, the Cold War was won. Gorbachev chose not to destroy the world as his party fell by launching a foreign war, which is something I never would have predicted. But the war was won because the United States of America had committed itself to a course of anti-communism, and that meant understanding. China is today's threat, and it is a fundamentally different threat than the Soviet threat, and it has to do with the history. Aside from my wife and relatives, my closest friend is a Presbyterian minister. His wife came to this country just before the Tiananmen Square massacre. Her father's family worked for Chiang Kai-shek, and he was left on the mainland. Her mother's family was a Christian family in China, and it has always been a difficult thing to be. His wife came to this country after having been brutalized only the way a former aristocrat, a former nationalist, and a Christian could be during the Cultural Revolution. She survived. She and I have been friends since 1989, and we're aliens to one another because Chinese culture is so fundamentally different from our own. On the continent of Eurasia, there are two prime civilizations and two intermediate civilizations. The intermediate civilizations are on the Indian subcontinent and in the Middle East. They are derivative. They have some original ideas and some ideas which come in from the outside, like middle children in a family. In Western Europe and in China are the two prime civilizations. Civilizations that are largely self-generated. They come up with their own ideas with limited influence from the outside. And China and the West have always seemed a little bit different. Here are a few basic differences. First of all, Europe remained divided. When the Roman Empire fell, Europe formed into nation states. And what that allows is for people who don't fit into whatever system is in the land where you grew up, you could leave. You could go to another country. There was diversity, there was heterodoxy. There was an opportunity to live a well-lived life. Also, the countries of Europe rubbed against one another. They competed with one another. And the heat created by the friction between those European countries is one of the prime movers in Europe being the civilization that becomes the first modern industrial global civilization. The competition. Well, China never went through that. China unifies a couple hundred years before Christ, and it remains a unitary empire to this day. That is a fundamental difference. Whereas Europe has many countries that compete, that fight, China has one overriding empire. So instead of the diversity of Europe, you have a conformity in China. The second thing, Europe suffers from a series of dark ages. When barbarians come in, European civilization collapses, falls, and has to rebuild. It happened in ancient Greece, it happened after the fall of Rome. China has not had a dark age since it was established, because Chinese civilization, instead of being like a beautiful bauble, like a chandelier, like a light, Chinese civilization is like a sponge. For example, when the Mongols came into China, Genghis Khan's generation stayed away from the cities and they lived like Mongols, and by the time Genghis Khan's grandson came along, Kublai Khan, he lived in a Chinese pleasure palace in Xanadu. He wore Chinese silks. He spoke Chinese as well as Mongolian. He had in effect been absorbed into the Chinese society. Again and again, when foreigners interact with China, they don't fall. There isn't a dark age. China brings in and absorbs those conquerors. So there's a resiliency to this unified empire. Now, the heart of Western civilization, aside from Greek ideas of freedom and Roman ideas of order, is the Christian notion, the Judeo-Christian notion, that we are created by God as individuals with inalienable rights and an immortal soul, that we as individuals matter. God created individuals, and we in the United States believe individuals then create government. In China, the chief figure is not Jesus Christ, it's Confucius. And Confucius, this is pre-communist, Confucius establishes not a religion of individual salvation like Christ does, but a philosophy of social harmony. In the West, God is an individual at the center of everything and relates to us as individuals through Jesus or through the prophets. We as individuals matter. In Confucian philosophy, the individual is a subset of the real life form, which is the family. That's why the family name comes first in East Asian civilization. Because it's not you, Laura Van Voorhees. It's Van Voorhees, subset Laura. In the West, glory is individual achievement. In Confucian society, glory is maintaining face and family honor. It's as if you're walking around with a giant goldfish bowl. Everything you do could cause that goldfish bowl to spill or be damaged. That is the family honor that you carry with you. So whereas we in the West are encouraged to be bold, to fight against City Hall, to grow up by learning to argue with your parents, in the East, they learn to carry the family honor, because if you fail, you bring shame not only to the living, but to the dead. Your ancestors in heaven, in the heavens, will be mocked. The little old ladies will mock your grandmother, your great-grandmother, for raising such a grandchild as you, because you were so free and loose with the family honor. So we in the West are taught to be individuals, to stand up. In China, they are taught to flow like willow branches in the breeze. That is Confucian society. Social harmony above all. In the West, gold is a reward for individual achievement to be spent by the individual. In East Asian Confucian society, the taipan of the family, the general, and the tai, his wife, they make decisions for the family wealth. So there is this fundamental difference that Westerners have difficulty understanding. We expect people to be as we are, individuals. For them, in traditional Confucian society, it is the family, it is the group. Also, the fact that you learn a word character-based language shapes the way your brain stores information. We learn phonetic language. 26 symbols, mix and match, makes every word. Not in China. In China, you have to learn word characters. And so this is why my friend's wife is an alien to me, because she learned a word character language. As much as we talk, as much as we understand one another, we really don't, because of this fundamental difference. She comes from that. I come from the West. Now, in the 1500s, the West first contacts China. And China's much more advanced and much more powerful than the Europeans. The only place on earth, aside from Japan, that Europeans come and find a superior civilization, superior in strength and sophistication to their own. So the Chinese look at the West as just a group of sea barbarians. In the early 1600s, an interesting moment happens. A new barbarian dynasty, the Manchus, had taken over China. And their most dynamic emperor, the Qiangxi Emperor, brings Jesuits into his court and considers converting to Roman Catholic Christianity, until the Qiangxi Emperor discovers that there's a pope, and it's not him. In the Chinese Confucian system, the emperor is the son of heaven. He is the fulcrum between the powers of the heavens and the earth. And his job, like a surfer on a surfboard, is to orient human society, Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, to be in harmony moment by moment with the various cosmic forces that they believe in. In other words, it's the vicar of the divine powers. In other words, the Chinese emperor is in effect the Pope. Now, the Qianqi emperor graciously offered to become the Pope as well as the Chinese emperor and to become a Christian. The Catholic Church said no. So instead, China closes off, so does Japan, in the early 1600s. And for 200 years, the Chinese say the problems of others are not ours. They turn their back on the world. Well, during those 200 years, we develop ideas of democracy and industry. And we in Europe then go out and re-contact the world, but this time as industrial powers. This begins what the Chinese called the Century of Shame. From the 1842 Anglo-Chinese War known as the Opium War, where the British Empire fights to import drugs into China. Because up until this point, the imperial government of China only accepted silver. When the British wanted to buy porcelain, you got to pay silver. When the British wanted to buy silks, you got to pay silver. By importing opium, the British break the demand that China only trade with foreigners with silver. The British spank the Chinese. They have a steamship. The Chinese have junks. For the next 100 years, China is battered by foreign powers. By England, by France, by Austria-Hungary, by Germany, by Italy, by Japan. In 1894, Japan, who also had closed off for 200 years, comes barging on China's doors. When China learned about the industrial West, they viewed the West as round-eyed barbarians. When Japan encountered the West, they realized, we've screwed up. By closing off, we've allowed ourselves to become weak. The emperor's at risk. And the purpose of the Japanese empire is to protect the God Emperor. So the Japanese become more Western than the Westerners, and they come into China in 1894 with modern battleships. And soon the Japanese, as well as the Europeans, are walking around in China above the law. The Chinese think that they need an antidote to the West. They try three things: Christianity, republicanism, and communism. In the late 1800s, the bloodiest wars in Chinese history, the Taiping rebellions, happened. Because a Chinese leader claiming to be Jesus Christ's younger brother leads a revolution to overthrow the imperial government and establish a new Chinese Christian state, Christianity with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese government brings in Western imperial troops to fight the Taiping. So the Christian idea of adapting to the West fails. In 1911 or 12, I forget, the Chinese Empire is overthrown by the Chinese Republic. The great Sun Yat-sen proclaims a Chinese Republic. But the Republic is weak and quickly descends into warlordism. Local generals and local politicians end up becoming independent rulers within China. Nothing works. China still remains under the Europeans' power. So republicanism in China, what's called the Kuomintang, the government that had to flee to Taiwan after the communists took over, it loses face among the Chinese people. One of the reasons that the Republicans end up failing is because for the last 10 years of their existence, they have to fight Japanese invaders. The Chinese Republic fought the Japanese. The Chinese communists went away and hid and waited for the Japanese and the Republic to fight and destroy one another. After World War II and the Japanese defeat, the Republicans faced off against the Chinese communists and they were destroyed. They were eaten. They were driven off to the island of Taiwan. The end of the Century of Shame, as is taught in Chinese history, is in October of 1949, when Mao Zedong's communists take over China. Okay, that's part one of the story. Do we have time for part two? Or do we want to wait until next week? Okay, well, I'm not going to say 45 minutes. You guys have been so great already. Okay, communism takes over just over 50 years ago. On the one hand, Mao believes, like Stalin before him, that the purpose of communism is to take society, smash it, and rebuild it according to communist lines. So for the first 10 years of Mao's rule, everyone who was a educated person, everyone who was a rich person, everyone who was a leader under the old system, everyone who's a Christian, is arrested and brought into re-education camps where the most important thing that they have to do is write their confessions. Write a confessional biography. Write a confessional biography explaining what they've done wrong. And these are given to and read by communist officials. Even in the upper parts of the Chinese Communist Party, Chou Enlai, the second most powerful Chinese communist, has to write these self-confessions and give them to Mao. Mao, their dictator, is the only one who doesn't have to write this. And what are these confessions used for? Well, they're used to amass evidence against people to put pressure on them, so that people cannot fight the Communist Party. The Soviets never did this. The Chinese do. This gives the Chinese Communist Party a level of control over their people that the Soviets never achieved. In the late 1950s, Mao decides it's time for the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward is the collectivization of agriculture. No longer will Chinese peasants own land. All land will be held in common. No longer will Chinese peasants decide what to grow, when to grow, how to grow it, how to run their own farms, because it's no longer their own farms. The collective will make all decisions. Now, Chinese peasants have been told by the communists, as they were trying to gain power, my God, you will get land. All the land will be divided among the peasants. They were betrayed, because all the land was divided among the peasants and then given to the collectives. Starvation on a scale unprecedented in our Western history resulted. In the midst of this, people were told to give up all their metal, to form their own smelteries, so that China could produce as much iron and steel as Britain. So the very tools, the hoes and rakes, that Chinese farmers needed to try their best to plant under this new system were being taken apart and smelted in backyard smelteries so that China could produce more iron ore. After 4 or 5 years of this, other Chinese communist leaders said to Mao, this has got to stop. Mao said, why? Tens of millions of Chinese people are dying, preventably. Well, there's more where that came from, Mao said. After all, history comes out of the barrel of a gun. We have the guns. One of our problems is overpopulation. This is actually helping China. But the other leaders stood firm. And by the early 1960s, around the time JFK was assassinated, the Great Leap Forward had to be stopped. Mao seemed to publicly apologize. And the forced collectivization in some places was even reversed. Food began to be produced again. Starvation began to slowly end. But Mao was not the kind of man to forget. In 1965, the year I was born, Mao struck back with the Cultural Revolution, a fight against the four olds: old ways, old customs, old thought, old ideas. The Chinese family restricted to one child, one couple, one child. Any other children born would be aborted. This resulted in 40 years of Chinese girls dying at a much higher rate in the womb and right after birth. Because if you're going to have only one child in China, better be a guy, because it's the son that takes care of the parents in their old age, not the communist government, and not daughters. That's why so many Chinese baby girls are adopted by Americans and Europeans in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, because otherwise their families, it's just bad. One couple, one child. Now the heart of Confucian society, as I told you, is the family. Think about that. Having many children is a source of pride, is a source of wealth. And now they're being forced to have one, but that's not all. The old language needs to be changed. Suddenly, everyone in China gets new simplified names. The very written language itself is simplified. Now, if you've ever read George Orwell's 1984, you know about Newspeak, a dictionary of approved words that shrinks year by year, making the language smaller and smaller. The communists actually do that. And most Americans have never even heard of it. The only place where traditional Chinese is written and spoken and where people have their real names is Taiwan, because it never went through there. So they force, in the most intimate ways, they control their people. One couple, one child. Everyone has a new name. Everyone must learn the new way of writing and never use the old way of writing. During the Cultural Revolution, my friend's wife's grandfather was still alive. He had dementia. He was put into a room most days with paper walls. And on those walls, he would write the truth of his life. He would write the truth of his experiences. And every week, the block mother would come, a Chinese Communist Party official, to inspect your home, to interview your family, to make sure that nobody was thinking wrong thoughts. My friend's wife's father, before the block mother came, had the task every week of tearing down the paper walls, putting up blank new ones, and burning them so that the block mother would never see what this old man was writing about the truth of his heart. That's intimate control. Everyone who was not a young 14-year-old Red Guard with an armband, a headband, a little red book of Mao's sayings, and an AK-47 was at risk. Every town, every village, every farm, every city neighborhood had community meetings where teachers were put in dunce caps, were excoriated for hours by prosecutors as enemies of the people, and were beat by crowds, sometimes to death. Teachers, dentists, doctors, anyone who stood above the mob, anyone who was a wealthy peasant before the collectivization, anyone who was an individual was targeted. Maybe they'd have mercy, well, not mercy, because that's not part of the Chinese Communist way. Maybe they'd be allowed to live as examples, but only if they made obeisance to the crowd, only if they humbled themselves before the mob, only if they cried to the high heavens of their guilt and of their deservingness of punishment, shame, and death. This goes on for 10 years. Between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution alone, Mao is the greatest mass murderer in human history. Adolf killed between 14 and 20 million people. Joe Stalin killed between 30 and 60 million Russians in peacetime. Mao Zedong kills between 60 and 120 million Chinese in peacetime. The government controlling the people through these policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Every single person who is basically, who achieves, wakes up and becomes aware after 1949 has grown up a victim of the Chinese Communist Party in ways that Americans can't even conceive. Well, things change. This is part 3. In 1974-75, Mao dies. His wife and her partners are overthrown. The Cultural Revolution ends. And a cute little guy named Deng Xiaoping becomes the chairman of the leader of China. He goes to America in the late 1970s, wears a cowboy hat, eats barbecue in Texas. And he allies Red China with the United States against the Soviet Union. This is what happened during the Cold War. China allied with whoever seemed the weaker party. They allied with Russia, but then they got disharmony. There was disharmony around 1960, and the Russians and the Chinese hate one another. In the late 1970s, China becomes an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union, which is fine. The enemy of my enemy is useful. But he seems to create a new China that's open to Western investment, Western travel, Western business, Western money. And so China seems to be opening up. In the 80s, China seems to be the party, the Communist Party, that's becoming less and less communist. But as the Soviet Union falls in 1988, 1989, 1990, the Chinese communists learn a valuable lesson from Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev falls because he doesn't send in the Spetsnaz and the Soviet Red Army to Poland when Poland frees itself, to Czechoslovakia, to East Berlin, to all of these places. Even the Soviet Union is allowed to fall. There's a brief coup Gorbachev does not launch a war against foreigners or against his own people. And we have him to thank for that. Reagan couldn't have made him do that. Bush couldn't have made him do that. Gorbachev chooses not to go to war. So the Soviet Union falls. The Chinese learn from this and they say, never will this happen to us. We are going to stay in power. And if we have to stay in power by blood, then we will use blood. June 4th, 1989, after months of pro-democracy demonstrators by people exactly my age, college students and others, who are demonstrating in the Plaza of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen Square, for freedom, the government has had enough. That cute little Deng Xiaoping sends in tanks. He only cherry picks units from the Chinese People Liberation Army, which is, by the way, not the army of the nation, but the private army of the Communist Party. The People's Liberation Army of China, all of their military, doesn't serve the state, doesn't serve the government. It serves the Communist Party itself. It is a party militia. Even then, in 1989, Deng Xiaoping has to cherry-pick units from the countryside who hate city folk on general principle. That's why you have unescorted tanks, tanks without infantry, driving in towards the center of Beijing. That's why that one man with his cardboard briefcase and his plastic lunch bag was able to step out from obscurity into the heart of human history and say, stop! Do not kill our students. They are our future. They are of us. They are our people. Had there been infantry there, he would have been dragged away. Too sweet. But he wasn't, because even the People's Liberation Army was unreliable. Deng Xiaoping sends in the tanks, gets the newspapers away to stop filming the guy. The next time anyone sees this, where there's a stain on the ground where the tanks rolled over him. The Tiananmen Square protests are crushed. The deal with China is this: free economy, controlled political system. You can make money, you can have a business, you can start a business. Heck, the Chinese economy is more free market than the American economy since Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. It is. It's easier for a person to start a business and to make money, and to keep that money. But don't you dare criticize the Communist Party. Don't you dare threaten its power. Because if you do, we'll squash it. We'll put you on trial, keep you in prison, have you confess and confess and confess, and in the 2 weeks leading up to your execution date, we'll fatten you up. We'll shoot you in the head in the back of the head with a single bullet. We'll bill your family for the price of the bullet, and we'll sell your organs on the international black market. That's the way justice happens in China. You can go to China if you have the money for a heart transplant, and you can schedule it.
Yeah.
Think about that. Think about that. How on earth can you schedule a heart transplant? Because they know when a heart's going to become available. Because they will make one available. Their political prisoners are used as organ banks. Sometimes they're not even killed. Sometimes they come out of an operation with only one lung or one kidney, left to languish and suffer and die. Don't you dare criticize the government. So free economy, controlled government. 5 minutes out from the end. In 2013-2014, a new leader appears in China, Xi Jinping. For the first time since Mao's death, we have a man who's truly ambitious. He doesn't call himself president, he calls himself chairman, the title that Mao used. In an anti-corruption campaign, President Xi, or Chairman Xi, is purging his political opposition. The truth is, everyone who's in the Chinese Communist Party leadership is corrupt by Western standards. Everyone takes. It's expected. It's normal. If you were a Communist Party official and you didn't engage in corruption, they'd get rid of you because they couldn't trust you. They couldn't trust you. You need to be corrupt. But now, Chairman Xi and his faction are purer than the wind-driven snow. Everyone else is open to anti-corruption charges. And with this power, Xi has made himself president for life, then chairman, head of the Chinese military. He has consolidated power like we haven't seen in China since 1974. He has also initiated the genocide of ethnic Muslims called Uyghurs in northwestern China's Xinjiang province. An entire population of millions of people is today, and has been for years, imprisoned behind bars. Millions of people. After the concentration camps, people said never again. It's happening. It's happening. In Xinjiang right now, you have entire communities, old women, little children, everyone else, learning Han Chinese, forgetting their own language, learning how to write in the modern system of Chinese, forgetting how they used to write in their native Uyghur. It is the intended destruction of an entire community of people. And the world sits by and watches. Heck, Disney made a new Mulan movie in the very place where this genocide is happening. In Tibet, the same thing has been going on more slowly for decades. Tibetan Buddhists are being outnumbered by Han Chinese immigrants into their area in their own country. Their language suppressed, their religion suppressed. The Chinese Communist Party outlawed reincarnation without government approval. You need the paperwork for your soul to leave your dying body and go to a baby. If you don't have the paperwork, it's not allowed. Do you know what this is about? The leader of Tibet is a Buddhist priest named the Dalai Lama, who reincarnates. It's the job of the Tibetan priesthood, when the old Dalai Lama dies, to find a new Dalai Lama. The Chinese government has made restrictions on who the priesthood can look at. So the Chinese government is going to pick the next religious leader of Tibet to be a tool of theirs. That's why they've outlawed reincarnation without government permission. Because they don't want the soul of the Dalai Lama going anywhere near power. This is the flag of Hong Kong when it was a British colony, when there was freedom in Hong Kong. In 1996, Britain left, and there was an agreement. For 50 years, one country, two systems. Hong Kong would keep its freedoms under the Communist Party of China, and the Communist Party of China would benefit from the money in Hong Kong. Hopefully you know that 2 years ago, massive protests began in Hong Kong because the Communist Party was violating that agreement. Now, anyone accused of a crime can be taken out of Hong Kong to mainland China and put in a black cell for as long as anyone wanted. A black cell is basically an underground closet with no air, with no light, in isolation for as long as the government wants. People go crazy under those conditions. In a city of 8 million people, they had protests as large as 3 or 4 million people in the streets. That's genuine protesting. Doesn't matter. As the Wuhan flu hit last June, the Communist Party instituted a national security law, basically making it legal for the Communist Party to punish anyone they want for any reason they want in Hong Kong. One country has one system now. The Hong Kong freedoms that were promised by the Chinese until the late 2040s, it's gone. And China has gotten away with it. Now, the nation of Taiwan, an independent country that was never part of the People's Republic of China. The island of Taiwan had been part of Imperial China up until 1894. Taiwan, which is a multi-party democracy that proves that Chinese people are good at democracy, is being overflown by Chinese jet fighters. The Chinese are doing this to wear out Taiwanese equipment. Their long-term intent is to reunify Taiwan with China by force or by reason. The Taiwanese bravely elected a pro-independence president and re-elected her, and she is a firecracker. The current president of Taiwan is a hero of mine because she insists that the country is a free and independent nation. Meanwhile, the Olympics call the people, the team from Taiwan, people from Taipei, the Taipei district of China. Taipei is the capital of Taiwan. Meanwhile, Delta Airlines and others apologized to China for including Taiwan as an independent country on their list of flights. Meanwhile, the Disney Corporation is in bed with the Chinese. Hollywood is in bed with the Chinese. And today, most movies are not made for you, Americans. They are made for the Chinese market. So whereas in Ronald Reagan's time, Hollywood came out with some great anti-communist movies to help awaken Americans to the threat, today, Hollywood makes movies that are pro-Beijing, pro-People's Republic of China. Where are we now? We're in a situation where our president's son was in bed with the Chinese in terms of business. We are in a situation where American businesses are being encouraged, don't worry about China, invest in China. Give them more money. Honestly, I think that this is the moral cause of our time. Because of the Chinese influence in our culture, in our schools, in our colleges, in Hollywood, in the government, and elsewhere, they're not going to become like the Soviets, isolated, marginalized, more wanting our freedoms. We're going to become more like them if we continue doing business with them. The Chinese Communist Party, through the Confucius Institute, has infiltrated American schools and American education. They claim the Chinese Communist Party has brought more people out of poverty in all of human history than any other group. Because they put them there in the Great Leap Forward. They put them in that poverty and then they took them out. Well, they didn't actually. It was Western investment that did. We need to decouple from China economically. We need to stop investing. We need to pull out. We need to rebuild industry in this country, or at least in countries that are allied with us. We need to view this as the existential threat it is. We are in a new war. The last thing I'm going to say is this. The one good thing about the Cold War was World War II. Every Soviet leader, from Stalin to Brezhnev, had personal experience with 30 million dead because of the Nazi invasion of Russia in World War II. They understood we will fight the Americans to a point short of war. Even Khrushchev was forced to back down in the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Russian leadership had experience with real war. The current Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping are brittle, isolated, pampered Brahmin princes. These people have never done anything but manage their slave population and fight internal conflict. They think they're seasoned. They think they're smart. They think they're experienced. They're not. They're brittle. And unfortunately, where this leads is, whereas the Russians were very clear never to push things to a point where we got into a shooting war with them directly, I'm afraid the Chinese Communist Party has strong elements within it that say that the only way the century of shame will be avenged is with American blood in Taiwan Strait. In other words, there are people within the Chinese leadership that want a definitive moment, a turning point moment, where the Chinese destroy a couple of American carrier groups, conquer Taiwan, and humiliate us, and where whatever American government is left after the struggle kowtows to them, bows to them as the new Central Empire on Earth. And that desire could lead to World War III, because I don't believe, even under Biden, that we'll put up with that. God knows we shouldn't. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, especially questions or no? Okay. Bev, you were first.
Well, I just wanted to, I think you might have answered it. Why did they want this? I was thinking that they wanted the economic dilemma, but it sounds like they just wanted.
Because by sealing our souls, they remove a competitor. By turning America into China. Chinese government politics is always about appearances, it's saving face. If Americans bow to China, that's what they want, because they can tell their own people, look, the Americans who used to be at the center of the world, they are recognizing that our system is better than theirs. And that gives them prestige. So, no, that's why. Sir, and then sir.
Question, why would a university president, or why are our university presidents, who supposedly know history, accept the Confucian Institute?
Because the way Chinese work in foreign, in influencing people in foreign countries, is they buy off the elites. There are dozens of sub-Saharan African countries whose leaders are the scum of the earth. But they get a lot of money from China. So they allow the Chinese to build ports, railroads, military bases, and to exploit the resources of their countries. And they're doing the same thing here. American elites, business and academic and government, are benefiting from business ties. Hunter Biden. And in doing so, they're being bought off. That's unfortunately why. Sir.
Just like our elites did, right?
Now, what's going on in China is that what happened, West possesses, they've lost at least 3 dams.
Yep.
And their main dam, the Three Gorges, is in danger.
Yes, it is.
Because they're getting overwhelming rains, And when they lose the mandate from heaven in Chinese culture,
Yeah.
they always change the leadership. Because
That's what's done in the past. No, what he's saying is exactly true. The Son of Heaven, the old Chinese emperors, maintained the mandate of heaven until natural disasters demonstrated that the gods were no longer in favor of this emperor and a dynasty would change. The problem is American tech companies have cooperated with the Chinese Communist Party to create face recognition technology that gives them a knowledge and control over the billions of individuals in their, of the plus 1 billion plus individuals in their society. They can track you if you're in China, wherever you go, whatever you do, and you will earn a social credit score. If you're loyal, you get benefits. If you're not loyal, you get treated worse and worse. And American tech companies built it for them and maintain it for them. Unfortunately, with modern technology like that, the question of the change, of the mandate of heaven being lost, they may be able to hold out. Because they have computer technology monitoring everyone and guns that they're willing to use very quickly.
now, if they lose those exams,
They lose tens of millions of people.
and they lose their industrial.
But they may go to war at that point to keep power. There is this belief that if we have trouble domestically, we start fighting overseas to bring people around the flag. So it's dangerous, but you're right, there is hope. Ma'am, you had something? Did you? I thought I heard something. Okay. Sir, you were next.
Yeah, I read the Bully of Asia by Mosher. Is that a pretty good book or not?
I've never read it, so I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Miss?
They built the base, I think, either New Mexico, Texas, somewhere in there, I think it's Texas. What do you think of that?
I hope it's not true. I hope that's not true. Look, the Canadians were going to host Chinese military bases until little Trudeau was exposed and he had to back off from that. I don't know anything about that. I know the Chinese have bases surrounding India. I know that they're trying to get leases to build bases around the world. I would be very surprised if they actually had it on American soil.
Also, there's the Dragon family. We know the families that are higher up with a lot of money, that are kind of you have the
Yeah.
and then you have China.
Yeah.
So it's a house divided against itself can't stand.
But they're not divided. The dragon families are suppressed. Jack Lew, the head of Ant, was probably the wealthiest man in China. He's been disappeared. The Chinese Communist Party has taken Jackie Chan, a man who I used to admire, and made him into a sniveling mouthpiece for the Communist Party. The dragon families have no power if the Communist Party takes that power away. So while it seems divided, Xi Jinping, who's a megalomaniac, wants nobody but him to be the idol. No Jack Ma's, not Jack, did I say Jack? Jack Ma. No Jack Ma's, no Jackie Chan's, no any of that, no. She, and only she.
Also, I've discovered that they are now on a rollback currency.
That,
Separate from the deep state, London, Vatican.
that is what they're doing with Mike. Look, the Obama administration in its first months went to China and said, let's get the US dollar out of the center of the global economy. And the Chinese laughed at it. Chinese economic students laughed at Obama because this was nonsense. But they are trying to do that, yes, indeed. Other questions, sir?
Is there a Confucius Institute at Boise State?
There may very well be. I actually
That's what
don't
I've
have the
heard.
heart. There probably is. And what it is again, they claim the mantle of 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. A civilization that for the last 50 plus years they've murdered. Actually, for the last 70 years they've murdered. They're not the inheritors of the emperors. They are something else entirely. They're disease, and hopefully the Chinese body will reject them at some point. God's will.
One more question.
Oh, sir, I'm sorry. I just want to, yes.
They don't have to start a war. All they have to do is stop making our products.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. No, we have to decouple so that we no longer get valuable drugs.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So changing their language, they have the 8 people in a vote caricature for their historical language. What do you think of that? Great club.
There is no thinking. Look, if you go to China and show a picture of the tank man at Tiananmen Square, people will either not know what you're talking about, they'll make believe they don't know what you're talking about, or they'll say, how dare you bring something like that up? How dare you air our dirty laundry? You guys, you foreigners, you foreigners, you have no right to talk about that. So why are they doing that? Because they really believe that? No, but because they speak out of turn. They're targeted.
What business is it of ours? What goes on in China?
Because we, since the Spanish-American War of 1898,
about that.
no, I am. You asked, I'll answer. I'll give you my opinion.
If you trigger a war with China, you're going to be on the inside of a mushroom without looking out.
Yep. Then again, what's the alternative?
What's the alternative? Mind your own damn business.
And let them take Taiwan. Let them take Japan. Let them
Taiwan
take
is
the
to
Philippines.
them. Taiwan is to them as Long Island is to you.
No, it is not. Taiwan is an independent republic.
I have seen this. I'm old enough to have watched people like you work for a long time.
Oh, come on
You
now,
trigger a
stop
war
it.
with China.
Oh,
You're
stop
out. This
this guy.
country is done.
Get him out of here. Sit down.
No, that's
Get him
fine.
out of here.
God bless. We can agree to disagree.
Hey, don't say that.
No, that's fine.
That's how you get
Look,
killed.
I've been called every name in the book. I'm a warmonger. I'm a militarist. There are all sorts of things. Hey, if we were able to decouple from China without a war, if they weren't simultaneously threatening the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, the Indonesians, the Malaysians, the Japanese, and even the Russians, the Chinese Communist Party is making claims on Russia. They're puppet. If we could decouple with them from them without a war, let's do it. Unfortunately, I'm convinced that the war will not come from us. The war will come from them because they wish to avenge the century of shame.
They'll make the first
Tippler,
move.
an astrophysicist, claims that there's a tradition that during the time of Christ, the emperor's chief astronomer was one of the Magi. Is there any history?
The only history I know of is that in the time, around 150 AD, in the time of the Emperor Marcus Antoninus, there was an expedition that went to China. We have records about it in China from the great Western Emperor Antun. So that was during the Pax Romana. But I don't know about, the Magi are an interesting question. I don't know. I think it's a matter of faith. Anyway, look, I have no problem with people disagreeing. I really don't.
Yeah.
Not that.
Okay, great job.
Yeah.